Thank you for joining Political Research Associates for the second of our summer webinar series today on white supremacy, mobilization, and resistance. Today we have four fabulous speakers with us. We have Zoé Samudzi, PRA Research Fellow, writer, and UCSF doctoral candidate in medical sociology. We have Stephen Gardiner, PRA Assistant Research Director of Racial and Immigrant Justice. Aislinn Pulley, co-executive director of the Chicago Torture Justice Center and founder of the Black Lives Matter Chicago chapter. And we have Lumumba Akinwole-Bandele, National Strategies and Partnerships Director at Movement for Black Lives, who will be joining us shortly. Today, we're going to start off with an overview of PRA's new white supremacy framework for understanding white supremacy, with Stephen and Zoe telling us, giving us some of the background for the project, explaining how it came to be. Then we will, after about a 25-minute discussion, shift to hearing from Lumumba and Aislinn, talking about the framework, responding to their framework from the context of their on-the-ground work as organizers. We will give it back to Zoe and Stephen to respond to Aislinn and to Lumumba, and then open for audience Q&A in the chat at the end of our webinar. We thank you all for joining us, and Zoe and Stephen, if you'd like to take it away, we'd love to hear, see an overview of the white supremacy framework and then launch into the discussion.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this for the first time. So before I kind of make a pass kind of through the framework, I want to talk about, there's a visual component and a written component. So for the visual component, which I'll show in just a minute, we're calling them logic models, and they're broken up into four categories or four kind of structures, which I kind of saw as the four major ideological nodes of white supremacy and white nationalism, although there are obviously like so many other components, to white nationalism and white supremacy, both kind of structural and movement-based. The first one is anti-Blackness, which is the kind of foundational system for policing and for surveillance and racial hierarchy and organization. The second one is xenophobia, which speaks to both real and imagined demographic shifts. And also the very first of which, and the kind of most fundamental, is the ongoing genocide and dispossession of indigenous communities that, whose oppression began when settlers arrived on this land. The third one is gender and sexual identities, which indicts both the kind of structures of cis heteropatriarchy, from violent sexism and gender norms to the union of anti-trans feminists and the Christian right and kind of everything in between. And then we have also anti-Semitism, which tries to capture the evolution from the kind of very, very, very old relationship between Jews in Europe and European Christendom, all the way to the kind of contemporary conversations around the boundaries of whiteness, Zionism, and all of that. And so the point isn't to kind of think about all of these structures discretely, right? Because no oppression happens in a vacuum. We're thinking about all of these systems of oppression together, and on the models, like, you'll see a fair amount of overlap, because when we're talking about anti-Blackness and surveillance, like, we're also talking about anti-Semitism and these politics around assimilation. And we're also talking about, gendered violence, and we're talking about the right, and we're talking about these attempts to control bodies and reproduction and all of that. So I think the reason that the visuals are really powerful is because it allows for a really clear kind of visual, or at least an attempt to really visualize both the ways that all of these systems of oppression work, but then also the way that these systems of oppression are co-constituted. So we can develop more effective frameworks for being in solidarity with one another, and also for kind of fighting against the state and for fighting against white nationalists. So we want to get into actually seeing the models a bit. Okay. So here, like it described, we have this is the structure for thinking about anti-Black racism. And the models are supposed to be a summary, right? They're not this kind of exhaustive description of every single thing that goes into each form of oppression, but kind of the most crucial points in our ability to understand how both the movement right and white supremacist structures kind of interact with the community and orient themselves around it. Obviously, we have to talk about colonization when we're talking about anti-Blackness. We begin with talking about colonization, the internationalism of fascist and settler states, because we can't understand anything that's happening in the United States without understanding how these similar dynamics are happening in countries all over the world, in Brazil, in Hungary. Of course, from colonization, we get into chattel slavery, which structures, so much of American life, right? It structures the prison system. It structures the police, which famously evolved from slave patrols. Also, enslavement structures how we understand citizenship, right? Because citizenship was initially defined as whiteness, maleness, and property ownership. And of course, Black people were property. And so much of what went into Blackness was this inheritability of property. So it was this idea that Blackness was not simply about your color. It was about you. It was about how Black women passed on their enslavedness to their children. So you have this racial identity that can be given to subsequent generations. Of course, when we're talking about the citizenship, the citizenship that so many white nationalists are responding to, we have to talk about the Reconstruction Amendments. We have to talk about the 14th Amendment, that gave citizenship to everyone who was born in the United States, which expands this previously exclusive understanding of citizenship, which is something that so many white nationalists of kind of different stripes are pushing back against. They're pushing back against, Black enfranchisement. They're pushing back against, non-white people who are able to access all kinds of institutions in ways that they were not previously able to, which informs the way that the American public is constituted. And, so we have Black people, non-white people in public being policed in all of these different ways, in ways that are reflective of the capturing of capital and of property. And Vicky Osterwal has a really great book called In Defense of Looting that's coming out soon, where she really does a really great job tracing the policing of public property, the policing of Black people, and the attempts to protect private property. So let's see. In this next one, we are talking about gender and sexuality. Obviously, we're familiar with, structural sexism, misogyny, and there are so many ways that these harmful ideas about gender, about, again, participation in public life are so tied to kind of conservative Christian theology. We hear about the moral majority, and we hear about all of these different encroachments on Christian values that are presented by like queer people and interracial marriages and whatever else. A really important part of looking at gender and sexuality, and also looking at the kind of very far right Christian ideologies, is this idea of the white family as this normative social and political unit. And so this is a part of the desire to protect, the sanctity of the institution of marriage, for example, because you no longer have this unit as a purely reproductive unit. It's not so much about the sanctity of the family as it is about the obligations of the people who make the family. When we talk about the 14 words, this desire to make a safe, home and country and place for white women and children, right? It is this evocation of the white family as this demographic tether, right? It is the white family that ensures the maintenance of a racial majority or racial supermajority, depending on kind of where a white nationalist or white supremacist falls in all of these different ideologies. And when we talk about this demographic anxiety, we're talking about, you know, the far right flip side to all of these news reports about how in 2025 or something like that, the United States is going to be a majority minority country. When you couple that with some of these stories about, these reports about white birth rates falling, you have this kind of this threat of white genocide, right? This threat of white disappearance. And this, you know, is part of the reason why so many of these folks, these white nationalists, these Christian dominionists, all of these, the people who kind of make up the far right theocratic structure are so vehemently anti-abortion, you know, not only because of this desire to control bodies, but also because they are afraid that white people will disappear. And so you have this obsession with womanhood that is tied to reproductive capacity, rather obsession with white womanhood as tied to these obligatory reproductive responsibilities. And this ties into, you know, the way that you have anti-trans feminists and the religious right teaming up to not only attempt to regulate what constitutes womanhood, but to also attempt to regulate masculinity, because that is how they approach and understand trans women, right? This failed masculinity. And so it's this attempt to realign masculinity with militarism and with violence, and this attempt to relegate womanhood and define it solely as a kind of childbearing capacity and in this like this maternal, these maternal responsibilities. So here with the big box around demographic anxiety, here is kind of the frame for thinking about xenophobia. Xenophobia starts most importantly with settler colonialism, of course, with the imposition of kind of settler values and norms onto already inhabited land that is understood as being empty, and the subsequent attempt to clear the land for settler interests. And you know, there's a lot of that old manifest destiny that we see in this idea of border imperialism, which Harsha Walia writes really incredibly about. You know, when we think about the migrant crisis on the southern border, we have to think about, you know, two things. We have to think about these settler drawn borders that are being protected. And we also have to think about the movement of indigenous communities between these two nation states, about the fact that the border is literally drawn through indigenous communities. And so when we're talking about movement, like we can't ever stop thinking about indigeneity and the violence that is enacted on indigenous land and on indigenous people. And the kind of flip side of indigeneity in thinking about the kind of the people who are actually indigenous to this land is thinking about white nativism. It's thinking about the ways that people who are trying to control immigration, who are trying to strengthen the borders, envision themselves as being the real owners of this land, the people who truly belong to this land, and therefore are able to dictate who is able to live on this land, leave this land, and come into this land. You know, with immigration, you know, in general, it's really important to think about how, despite knowing that border regimes and everything are incredibly racist, generally immigration policy is facially neutral, right? Like we know it's discriminatory, but there is no, it's really difficult to prove intent to discrimination or to discriminate. But with the kind of what we describe as the Muslim ban, like that was the first piece of facially non-neutral immigration policy passed since the Chinese Exclusion Act, and this explicit attempt to limit the ability for Chinese people to come to the United States and work and live in the United States. And so with this idea of demographic anxiety and immigration, you can see a clear tension between one of the first clearest tensions between structural domination and kind of structural colorblind white supremacy and the desire for racial supermajoritarianism, which is white ethno-nationalism, right? So there's a difference between white supremacists who are perfectly happy to have Black and Indigenous and Latinx and whomever people living in the United States, as long as they kind of stay within certain geographically bounded areas and are able to be exploited and regulated, versus people who simply believe in the creation and maintenance of a white ethno-state, which means that, you know, people either have to be killed, deported, fully incarcerated, whatever. And here we kind of see the interplays between white supremacist ideology and the structural violences and some of these like militia movements and these patriot movements who are controlling the borders, who are trying to get local sheriffs and law enforcement to share these really kind of hostile, incredibly militantly anti-immigrant beliefs and ideas. And you see real interplay and interaction between these non-state actors, these non-state social movements, and these white supremacists and white nationalists who are a part of the state. And then lastly, but not least, of course, we have anti-Semitism. And I think that as we see with conversations that are on, you know, social media and elsewhere, I think that anti-Semitism might be one of the most difficult forms of racism and structural oppression and exclusion and violence or whatever for people to understand, because there can often be a really unclear, you know, idea of where Jewish folks, particularly Jewish people who are racialized as white, kind of fit into social structures. Of course, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we have to start like centuries back, when we are looking at the Catholic Church and other religious institutions, like making these rules around how Jewish people are able to participate in public life in Europe. We have, you know, all of these, you know, we have edicts around, you know, Christians not being able to deal in money that collects interest. And the people who are able to do this are Jewish people. And so we, you know, there are all kinds of different canards about like Jewish people controlling finances and controlling money and whatever. And these anti-Semitic ideas literally come from these hegemonic Christian policies that seek to place Jewish people in margins, that seek to concentrate where people are able to live. And when we see this transformation from historical Judeophobia to anti-Semitism, we kind of, the way that it's kind of described in the report, it's this evolution from a religious minoritization, which is, to be clear, incredibly violent, to this project of race making that happens in concert with the rise of eugenics and race science in Europe, and you know, and as it's exported in different parts of the colonized world. You know, we start to hear these discussions of Jewish people as a Semitic race of people, as being outside of the Aryan, as being outside of Europeanness. And this politic is crystallized most clearly, of course, by Nazism, which is taking all of these kind of historical ideas about Jewish outsiderness to its most logical, violent, genocidal extreme. Because when we're thinking again about, you know, the demographic anxieties that I described earlier, you know, the concern now that being Jewish has been turned into this particularly racial identity, right, is this idea that Jews who are white are racial infiltrators, right? You can no longer tell who is really white and who is Jewish. And so you have, you know, all of these conspiracies that are mobilized around the erosion of whiteness, of Westernness, of Christianness. You have these expressed contempt for cultural Marxism, for all of the things that George Soros does in funding these social justice movements that are undermining good white Christian democracy. It is the kind of combination of these historical tropes of kind of these kind of cultural religious tropes about Jewish people and their purported control, kind of combined with these preoccupations with defending the purity and sanctity of whiteness. And what we see a lot with these alleged critiques of kind of capitalism, right? Like oftentimes anti-Semitism is expressed through a critique of the monopolization of resources, like we have on here, the control of financial resources, this idea that Jewish people are elites, that they are controlling from above. And there's this really interesting idea of anti-Semitism as, a foreshortened anti-capitalism. It's this attempt to kind of critique there is actually a control of resources, by a few people, but they're not, it has nothing to do with them being Jewish, right? It has everything to do with whiteness and with capitalism. And there are, Jews who are white and incredibly rich, but if we're having a conversation about oligarchy, if we were having a conversation about hoarding of resources, right, it is not about Jewish people. It is about whiteness, and it is about capitalism. And so there's this very easy conflation that people do often when they are allegedly critiquing elites, and it just, they happen to be only kind of critiquing what they understand of this kind of historical hoarding. And that's something that we have to be really careful about. Oh, and then last but not least, I think it's important to kind of think about how Zionism fits into this model of anti-Semitism, because it's really important that we see a lot of people on the right, looking to Israel as a model of the kind of ethno-state that they want to create in the United States. There was this, what is his name? Richard Spencer is like really vocal about his support for the kind of racially hierarchized model of politics and life in Israel, because that is what he wants to emulate here in the United States. And it's also very important to note that a lot of the people who in the United States are the most emphatically supportive of Israel are Christians, right? Are like far right Christians, because of the way that Israel fits into kind of end times theology, and they express the support for Israel while being like deeply and violently anti-Semitic, right? Like there were so many religious figures that supported the movement of the embassy in Israel who like weeks prior were giving sermons about how all Jews were going to go to hell, right? There's this, it's incredibly important to kind of tease out the way that Zionism can certainly be a cover for anti-Semitism, for people expressing a contempt for Jewish people, like through this cover of Palestine solidarity, but also support for Israel in itself coming from so many members of the right is anti-Semitic, right? Because in order for Israel to survive, right, Israel makes all of these different allyships, like with members of the far right, like of rather heads of state who are fascistic, who are also Holocaust deniers, right? It's this really complicated matrix where it's like we want to make a world that is safe for Jewish people, but we cannot make a world that is safe for Jewish people while there are far right leaders in nation states that are trying to export fascism around the world. Okay, that's it. I'm sorry if we've gone longer than we're supposed to.
It's fascinating, Zoe. Thank you so much for walking us through those models. I'd like to ask both you and Stephen, as the PRA team, why this project and why now? Why are we reevaluating how we map and think about white supremacy? What launched the project, and how did you two sort of land on the structure that it's currently taken?
I'll jump in a little, and then maybe I'll pitch it back to Zoe. part of what's going on with our desire to build this model, for number one, this is not intended to be, okay, let's draw up these models so that we can, or this framework so that we can know things. It's intended to drive strategy. Number two, there are ways that PRA has been talking about the relationship between systemic racism and white supremacy and social movement white nationalism for a long time. We've just never formalized this. And in the process of formalizing it, part of the point was to reach out to our partner organizations and movements to try to engage with them to say, how can we make this better so that it will better inform strategic thinking and collaboration? And then, of course, this moment right now is one where we are seeing the right in both its state and institutionalist version, which has been building itself for decades through the operation of right-wing social movements, alongside the insurgence of right-wing social movements, some of which are pro-state, pro the current administration, some of which are anti-state and anti-current administration. They fall all over the place. And so that was our primary impetus, plus being asked by folks to sort of formalize our partners in philanthropy as well as in movement organizations to formalize some of what we often talk about when we have this underlying model of understanding how we're going to talk about why is it important to talk about white nationalists or the far right, people who are sometimes marginalized? And part of the answer to that is that we see them as part of an ecosystem that is in a call and response relationship with the state. Sometimes they amplify the state, sometimes they oppose the state, sometimes they try to accelerate the state by committing, for example, acts of violence. And of course, in the last couple of years, we've seen everything from the normalization of racialized anti-immigrant policies in public rhetoric, so that we now have a president who uses rhetoric that is more explicitly racist than the legacy anti-immigrant groups like FAIR. At the same time, we've seen accelerationist violence from anti-Muslim, anti-Black, and anti-Semitic actors, and quietly the proliferation of policies that are attacks on the public good that undermine the very idea of a democratic state. And I will stop there and try to throw this back to Zoe and maybe say, could you say some stuff about the three-way fight?
Yeah, I think that what's been the most interesting and important for me in working on this has been trying to kind of demystify what gets like homogeneously described as white supremacists. Because yes, they're all white supremacists, but they're not all the same. And it isn't to say that we need to pay like super, super close attention to every single type of neo-Nazi group that pops up, but it is to say that because they have different targets, because some of them want to work with the state, some of them want to work against the state, whatever, it means that we have to engage them differently. It means that there have to be strategies to avoid violence, to counter the violence, to think about recruitment or whatever in very different ways. What's been most interesting also has been thinking about the three-way fight. So it's not just thinking about, the state and everything else is like epiphenomenal and is not really important to think about, but it's been interesting to try to synthesize the relationships between the state and the groups. So you have some groups that are more institutionalized. You have these think tanks, you have these media groups. You have these like sheriff's organizations that are appearing at the White House that Trump is saying nice things about and retweeting. You know, he's saying that there are good people on both sides in Charlottesville. You have people who are engaged in what Stephen described as this call-and response, where they are trying to push policy to the right. They're trying to influence or even become a part of the state apparatus. And so, you know, we are in this really kind of tricky, you know, position where we have to look at the state and we have to look at these movements simultaneously. And it's not so kind of straightforward to say it's us versus them, because then how do we think about, for example, you know, Boogaloo Boys showing up to Black Lives Matter protests? Because we have to think of and talking about how, you know, police violence is bad. So if we cast them into the same group as white nationalists and we kind of leave them in this pool of white nationalists, there's no way of understanding that, okay, there are some Boogaloo Boys that have been arrested for trying to use the cover of protest to accelerate whatever plan and idea that they have. And others who appear at the protest in apparent support of the protest, but they're simply there because they also hate the state and they hate the police and they want to see the state and the police dismantled. But they're not anti-racist, so right. So it can be really, what's the word? Kind of seductive to think that, you know, we're on the same side because we hate the government, but not all disdain for the government is the same, and we have to be kind of careful about whose politics we get enticed by, or whose maybe promises of potential, whose promises of potential allyship we kind of sign up for.
We're about to shift to ask some of our interlocutors to jump in. I just wanted to say thank you, Zoe, and how much of a pleasure it has been working with you since we started this project a few months ago. And this is a journey for all of us, and we're in our next phase looking to really be engaged openly with some of our partners. So thank you.
Yes, thank you both. This is a great transition to inviting some of our partners into the conversation at an early stage. Lumumba, if you'd like to take the first shot at responding to some of the things Zoe said, to the models and how you see it relating to the work that you're doing in the field.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Zoe, for your presentation. Thank you, Steve, and definitely Koki. Lumumba-Bandele, I am the National Strategies and Partnerships Director at the Movement for Black Lives. I think it's important to really ground this conversation. I think you did a good job historically in sharing some of this, but understanding that, you know, white supremacy as a foundational framing is something that has informed all of our lives, in every aspect of our lives. There's no way we can escape it. There's nothing in this country that is exempt from any manifestations of white supremacy. And so when we talk about it institutionally, it's absolutely every institution that we come in contact with, from educational institutions to religious institutions, health institutions, all of those things. And it shows up in policy, of course. And we know it is most powerfully present within the broader culture. And so I think for us at the Movement for Black Lives, you know, we are part of the Black freedom movement, the Black freedom tradition. And the Black freedom tradition has been fighting white supremacy since it showed up on the shores of West Africa and started its process of enslavement and kidnapping African people, right? That Black freedom movement still exists today. And so we make a very strong connection between all of that and recognize that in that process, there are a number of things that we have been doing to continue to battle against that. And that battle really fundamentally is about the preservation of our lives, the preservation of our dignity, the preservation of our ability to live as full human beings in this world. And so not just within the United States, but within this world, you know, and it's important at some point to, you know, if we want to spend time dissecting white supremacy is to really, you know, explore the way it shows up throughout the rest of the globe. You know, because white supremacy in the UK looks different than it does in the States. You know, it looks different in in the Caribbean, than it does in other parts of the place. But that also speaks to the flip of what white supremacy mandates, which is in the Black experience, Black inferiority, right? And white supremacy cannot exist without the internalized belief of Black inferiority. And so much of what the Black freedom movement has been doing in particularly the work of people like Marcus Garvey to talk about, our Africanness and how we are fully who we need to be and don't need to be attaching ourselves to anything else, has been an attack on that, and it's been an attempt to really push back on some of those things. And Zoe, I appreciate, and I'm making a sharp pivot here, but I appreciate the time you spent in talking about anti-Semitism and the connection in relation to white supremacy and how it is almost in this particular environment impossible to critique Zionism without being labeled anti-Semitic. And so we know that our movements have been under attack because of our positions supporting Palestinian self-determination, because of our positions supporting an end to the occupation in Palestine, and being labeled as anti-Semitic. And this label sticks because people don't challenge it. It sticks because people equate any kind of critique of a settler colonial state under a religious guise as something as being anti-Semitic. And so I think those conversations are significant and important. And then lastly, I'll say that our current work around abolition, around the defunding of the police, is an explicit attack on white supremacy. This intentionally attack on that because it exists. Those kinds of carceral structures exist because they are rooted quite firmly in the belief that our lives are not valued, that we are still commodities, that we are still unhuman. And so I think that when we are tying, again, the current manifestation of what our freedom movement looks like, the objectives of it, we really have not left the beginning objectives of really reaffirming that our lives are at stake and are worthy, and that our humanity and dignity is certainly worth fighting for. And so I'll pause there.
Great, thank you so much. I have a request for presenters to speak up a little bit, but I'll just transition us to asking Aislinn for your input and your take on this white supremacy framework.
Hey, thank you. Is this volume okay? Yeah, okay. I really found the presentation fascinating. And I kind of, in an ideal world, would love to just be able to kind of sit with it and process it a little bit more because there is so much in it. But my immediate thoughts, are both related to what's happening on the ground here in Chicago, which is where I'm at, born and raised, and where I've been organizing for 20 years, is definitely locally, is specific to the local dynamics here. But I'm also sitting with the analysis and the presentation in context of the news that we found out today regarding the Commerce Department revealing that the GDP in the United States has dropped to 32.9%, which is the largest drop in its history. And so I'm also thinking about the global implications, the national and global implications of this crisis. And for comparison purposes, the largest drop that occurred during the Great Depression was 4 times less as large as the current one that we're experiencing now. And we know that the unemployment numbers continue to increase, and that we're at nearly 50% of unemployment in this country as of May. And we can assume that that will likely hit actual 50%, which again reflects the largest percentages of people unemployed in this country that were on par with the heights of the Great Depression. We also know that the unemployment relief has not been extended, so that the 20 million people who have been receiving the $600 weekly emergency unemployment payment will no longer receive that. And so we are expecting a surge in evictions in the coming weeks and in the coming months. And sitting within that, we also recently experienced collectively the fact that the Federal Reserve was given loans of up to $1 billion a day in April and in May. And none of that investment made it to any of the population of the United States aside from the top billionaire and now trillionaire class. Now that during this economic crisis, the world's first trillionaire has also been birthed. And so within this context of thinking about and considering these multiple aspects of this economic crisis that we have yet to really feel the impacts of yet, along with the rise of white supremacy and the ability to really deepen analysis around what white supremacy serves, what is its function systemically, nationally, and globally, also feels resonant to talk about, and of course is part of why this is necessary, is to also talk about the uprising that we're also in, which is the largest global uprising against policing that we have ever seen in history, and which is directly tied to the global construct of capital, which is rooted in white supremacist control, the creation of the white ethnicity, right? The creation of the logic that supports carving up the rest of the world for quote unquote Western expansion and profit and all of that. And so sitting within all of that, we're also experiencing the rapid drive toward what we know of as classical steps toward fascism, with federal troops in Portland being deployed and disappearing protesters, waging violence that the United States in previous years would always identify as being representative of a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime that is now potentially being replicated here in Chicago with the collusion of both the local, of the mayor, Lori Lightfoot, along with Trump, under a guise of law and order. And the interesting utilization, which is consistent with what we have seen throughout the rise of neoliberalism since the last huge upsurge in Black radical movement in the 60s and 70s, is using the coded language of law and order to then enact extreme repressive measures by the government, utilizing these justifications that then are carrying out a white supremacist doctrine, or carrying out the hegemony and the practice of white supremacy that in decades prior would have been labeled more bluntly, but now is being, now there's a narrative over intracommunal violence that is being used to make that cover. And in Chicago specifically, this is particularly alarming and resonant with the current fight against Chicago policing specifically, because the last time that we saw this large upsurge in coordinated governmental repression of Black communities, John Burge, who is the former Chicago police commander, was a part of leading a torture ring which tortured, at a very conservative estimate, at least 100 primarily Black men. Now that is a conservative estimate because that's based on the people who have come forward, the people who have engaged in lawsuits with attorneys. And so that by itself requires a level of privilege and articulation that we know is not representative of the masses of population that actually experience that brutality. And because of the way that gendered violence operates within within this country and this society, we also know that the fact that women have not come forward in the same amount does not mean that women and femmes were not brutalized, but that the societal repressive efforts have silenced many women and femmes from coming forward. So in Chicago, with this admitted history of CPD torture that occurred under the guise of the repression during Reaganomics, during the rise of neoliberalism and mass incarceration, with the mass arrests of gangs, is repeating now, is a huge red flag, because we know that we know that, one, we still have a torture site which exists openly on the West Side, Holman Square, that continues operating, and which a very suspicious supposed suicide of a Black cop occurred just 2 days ago. It is in full operation, and while the city is under a forced consent decree that community groups had to litigate in order to be placed in operation, because the federal government refused to respond to the DOJ report that condemned CPD and said that there's a pattern and practice of racist, unconstitutional behavior. So we're in this interesting tinderbox of which at the crux, I am increasingly viewing as a crisis that we have not yet successfully and adequately developed language to describe, which is really about ultimately the foundational tenets of US capitalism and global capitalism as we currently understand it to be, which is based, of course, in white supremacy. And this, the opportunity for challenging and delivering decisive blows to this global paradigm are making itself revealed in ways that we haven't seen in quite a long time. And so while we're both sitting in, and I'm sitting with in the reality that we may have federal troops that may attempt to come here, like we've seen in Portland, there are also historic openings in resistance and in fighting that is underway. And so this is a very ripe time for both analysis and action. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. We have some time built in for the four of you to have a discussion, for Stephen and Zoe, for you to respond to Lumumba and Aislinn's comments. I would love to hear the four of you sort of pick up from this point.
I would like to defer to Zoe to ask the first question, but I'm eager to speak to a couple of Lumumba's points.
Yeah, Aislinn, I'm actually really appreciative of all of these through lines that you threaded, especially kind of sitting with the relationship between the kind of current economic moment and this rise of fascism. I think what's really important is particularly this kind of acceleration of policing, whether it is the federalization of kind of anti-protest responses or you know, whatever else. Like, it is obviously historically no surprise, right, when a country goes into economic freefall, that you start getting troops out onto the street. What I think is really interesting about this moment is this particular charge against anarchism. And, you know, it's not that I'm an anarchist and I'm like especially scared for my life or anything, but it is really interesting to think about who, and not just President Trump, right? Joe Biden was like, we want to prosecute the arsonists and the anarchists. It's really interesting to think about what the state and what the kind of political establishment understands as being the most acute threats at this moment. And what anarchism or anarchy as this kind of boogeyman especially represents, and with the kind of conflation of anarchism, which I guess you could tie to the arsons that were happening at the beginning of the protest movement, with the continuation of protests that are, you know, explicitly in support of, you know, defunding and the abolishing of police, but especially, you know, explicitly in support of Black life. And I don't really, I'm going to think about this more in the report, and I don't know what to think. to be honest. You know, it's, the thing about this is it's like, I was talking to Stephen this morning about how I'm going to wait until the very end to finish the introduction, because the introduction is intended to frame everything, and everything is moving at such a pace that it gets hard to kind of keep up with what's happening. But I think the most important parts are that people, and we already know, right, the kind of economic precarity that exists. I think I saw a chart that said like, it was like at least a third of people in every single state were not able to afford housing on the minimum wage of that state. And we're getting to a point where like eviction, we're going to have an eviction crisis in the fall. We're going to have the kind of confluence of these like racial crises and economic crises. And what I am most afraid of is, I am most afraid of the kind of coordination of law enforcement. And it's not even necessarily a fear of like federal troops, right? Because, you know, as Melissa Guerra-Grant wrote in a really great article in the New Republic, like local police work like in these kind of mysterious, nebulous, terrifying ways that we would attribute to federal forces, right? Like we saw the NYPD on tape pushing someone into a van. And so what my concern is just really thinking about how they are going to come after people who are posing or who are presenting resistance. Like, yes, there are all kinds of ways that we're going to be getting creative, and we have been getting incredibly creative. But there are also all kinds of new ways that they're going to start criminalizing and repressing differently. Like we already saw the whispers of this with the the Black identity extremist, right? And we've seen the expansion, the recently like re-signed anti-domestic terror bills, and historically, as well as the kind of relationship between economic collapse and intensified state repression. We have also seen states use emergency to expand authoritarian power. So people keep saying, you know, Trump doesn't have the ability to do this. Well, you technically don't have the constitutional ability to do a lot of things, but historically, like fascists aren't that concerned about rules. So I'm just, I'm hoping that what this can be is a kind of like dynamic response to things as they are changing, and kind of a broad understanding of the fact that like, here are the historical threats that have been presented. Here are the acute threats that are being presented to us and will change in the future. I also do want to like uplift your comment about, you know, gendered violence specifically, with you know, both the Say Her Name frame and thinking about, you know, the women who were likely victims of police torture at the hands of the CPD, and the ways that women in particular like bear the brunt of poverty, of the effects of poverty. I think that one of the most important things we have to think about like is the kind of the compounded harms, right? The harms that are compounded by gender and disability, and all of these other things as we kind of see this structural harm expanding.
I mean, there's so much rich stuff here. It's hard to even attend to a particular point. I'm going to go back to Lumumba's excellent point about how M4BL and the Black Liberation Movement is in this current moment challenging white supremacy directly through the Defund the Police campaign, and to think about how this framework might help us think through, and why we need partners to help think through what that will mean in terms of far-right responses to that campaign. Because not only are we going to need to push that, continue to support that campaign to defund the police, but there's going to be reactions to it. We're already seeing, of course, the intrusion of paramilitaries of various ideological kinds, from outright white nationalists to, as Zoe mentioned earlier, some folks who say that in some sense they support the Black Lives Matter movement, even if it's a very shallow kind of support grounded in get rid of the cops and get rid of the government and let capitalism take care of everything. And as long as we all have guns, we'll be fine. But what are some of those consequences? Well, we can look at this social movement model and its relationship to the state and see that we can pretty much predict, like dropping a stone and having it fall to the ground, that as pressure comes on local police departments to defund or campaigns or realities, more cops are going to join paramilitaries. We know there are paramilitaries already involved with cops, but more are going to be attracted to those movements. That's one. Two, privatization of policing. I mean, the defund the police movement doesn't mean, oh, let's turn this over to Blackwater now. Three, federalization and politicization, okay? So how do you get more bang for your buck with policing if local municipal police are defunded, which are the ones that are vulnerable? I mean, of course, everyone would say, okay, let's defund the FBI as well, or ICE, but they're much less vulnerable, especially like the FBI, who are in effect the political police, to this kind of pressure. And so we don't want to replace one form of oppressive policing with another form. So we need to be able to use this model and help us think through what to predict and then take action in advance, so that this moves forward in a way that works and that is successful, which of course everyone in movement is what everyone wants, but people hear the slogan and they don't necessarily have all of that understanding that is lodged, like at M4BL and in other movement organizations.
I'm not sure if we're responding. I was waiting.
No, please do.
Please, okay, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for sharing that, Stephen, because one of the things we've been seeing here, increasing, quite honestly, particularly in New York City, as some businesses try to do what they think they're doing in terms of aligning themselves with defunding the police and no longer relying on the police for security of their businesses and other things, they're hiring private security firms. And these security firms, most of them, because of the way this industry actually works, are either former or off-duty law enforcement. And so their whole framing is still policing, right? You still have an armed force, whether they are state sanctioned, whether they're representing the state, whether they are enforcing laws of the state is another thing, but you still have this entire kind of construct that continues to replicate the problem that we know we're fighting against. And so this idea of really having to have us reimagine not only what, broadly public safety looks like, but how do we really create other dynamics of security from a business person's perspective? Like what would they need to be able to see to know that what they have in mind is still a problem in terms of policing, in terms of the vulnerability and impact it would have on Black bodies? What are some of those immediate things? And I think those kinds of conversations are absolutely necessary. We're really grateful for the organizations that are doing this kind of work, that are sitting down with people and really having them disrupt what they think safety looks like and feels like. Because that's where it's going to be. That's where it's going to be when people recognize that this whole fallacy that we've been living with for generations, since the concept of policing exists, that police keep us safe, has been a huge problem. And that has been what people have been clinging to, which is why some of the police reform stuff has been so difficult to advance, which is why we are now really where we are, which is calling for the really centralization of getting to the problem, which is really about abolition and defunding. Yeah.
I think I've been thinking a lot about that, which is, I think, I don't know if it's accurate to call it a contradiction, but definitely a consequential concern that we need to have some more of a mainstream dialogue around, in order to understand the consequences that we can predict are possible, and that we have seen be possible in other instances of quote unquote dismantling of police departments, where just other policing entities then absorb the role that those prior bodies were enacting. And we know that capitalism, and this is where, you know, I'm wrestling with how do we craft better language? How do we craft more concise kind of language for the movement in this moment, knowing that the capitalism's need for a repressive armed force has not in any way been diminished. And if we are successful just superficially in defunding the local municipalities, it will immediately be replaced by another body that will have more than likely zero oversight compared to the abysmal oversight that currently exists in police forces nationally. And so how do we prepare ourselves as a movement to tackle, to address that, and then understand what are our next demands? How do we deepen our demands and deepen the fight that against the system, be it as an abolitionist or other forces, you know, that are being self-identified in this moment. I think that point is so important in this moment, and we're seeing what's happening in Minneapolis play out. That's kind of driving the importance of this home, where merely having a city council vote to disband a police department that they actually don't have power to do has limitations, right? If we're thinking about the mechanism of city council and municipalities in their legitimacy and demanding it within the frameworks that they currently exist, and it places we can get stuck in their logic, which is that they actually don't have the power per their charter to dismantle the policing, and so therefore now they're looking at a reduction of something like $1 million, or, you know, some nominal amount of the Minneapolis Police Department. And so if as a movement we're not then prepared to demand further and force and deepen the political crisis that we've created for them, it does leave loopholes for them to say that they've enacted some kind of change when really it's been cosmetic or it's been performative, and hasn't actually been structural or substantive. So I've really been wrestling with those things. And then regarding the anarchism focus, I've also been thinking about that too. And in some ways, I'm completely open to exploring this and want to explore this more, but my gut reaction is that in many ways, using anarchism as the identifying kind of leftist body is an easier role for the state, instead of because anarchism, especially U.S. anarchism, has been so white and so white dominated, it allows them then to completely ignore the Black resistance movement that is ongoing, and instead ignore the fundamental arguments that we're making and the demands on the state that we're making, by then focusing on this particular, element that they've identified, right, as being the true problem, along with all of the narratives that are often used to, to malign anarchists. And I think we've seen that done historically too, especially in moments of increased Black rebellion. And also is how certain tactics that can be identified as, along the anarchist spectrum, can be used then to divert focus away from the demands of that masses of Black people have been organizing around. And so I think it's an effective way for the system to not address the shit that we're putting at their feet. And it can also be used unintentionally disruptive to the movement, if not conscious about how it's being used and the conditions in any particular moment.
I think that that is a good point. And I think yes, I think that, yeah, it is generally deployed as a means of like delegitimizing all forms of Black rebellion, whether they are the kind of more peaceful, nonviolent protest or otherwise, like we just saw in John Lewis's funeral today, that Bill Clinton was like, you know, you almost got away from us like for 2 or 3 years with like Stokely Carmichael, but you know, we brought it back with John Lewis. You know, this very this clear desire to have a particular kind of protest that is manageable, that is quiet, and the anarchists are kind of used as this foil to show that like we'll deal with you if you are calm, and when you're not, you know, we want to prosecute you and do whatever we want to. But I also do think that in addition to what you have correctly described, I think that there's something about the way that they're going after Antifa as this kind of block that reminds me of how the state uses gang databases. So I remember, I think in like 2018, when it was one of the number of times in the Bay when a whole bunch of right-wingers came to Berkeley. And after it happened, what ended up happening on this one particular day was like a whole bunch of people in Black Bloc like pushed a bunch of white supremacists out of a park. And the response by Nancy Pelosi and others was that it was this continuous use of the word thug. This continuous use of the word thug to talk specifically about Black Bloc, and this desire to not only prosecute them, but the mayor of Berkeley was saying that they should be treated like gangs. I really feel like this is that, because with the gang database, it doesn't matter if you're in a gang or not, right? Like if your buddy's in a gang and you hang out with him, you can get nabbed or put on the database without your understanding. So if we're all being surveilled, and we should just be assuming that we're all being surveilled, any kind of interaction with what they deem to be anarchist elements could be justification for criminalization and repression, right? Like we only have to look at what happened with the J20 protesters, where there were people who were like responding to something on Facebook or talking to someone on a public social media platform, and that was used as a charge for like conspiracy, kind of using these same logics of these like gang affiliations, which as we remember are obviously anti-Black. So it's like this conflation of, or this collapsing of like the outside agitator as a means of like undermining the legitimacy and like the organicness and the reality of Black resistance that looks like all kinds of things, with this strategy for sweeping repression. Because it doesn't actually matter, as we saw with the Black identity extremist, like the way they defined it, it's like you could be an occasional attendee of BLM meetings, or you could be in the Not Fucking Around coalition. It doesn't matter. If you are expressing any kind of very public support for Black life, for the Black movement, you are a Black identity extremist. So I think, yes, you are correct. And if we're thinking about this like materially with this kind of threat of fascistic repression, we also have to think about it as a tool for kind of this sweeping criminal, like even further criminalization of.
I wanted to, if I can really quickly respond to something in the chat that Tarso had posed to all of us and had called me as well. And I want to complicate the conversation a little bit, you know, because I want to make a distinction, of course, between organized security formations in Black communities from these policing and other kind of dynamics. And I want to make a distinction because throughout the entire history of the Black experience in this country, what has consistently been able to minimize the loss of our life has been our ability to defend ourselves and in organized manners. And so, when we talk about wanting to, push back on this idea of, these independent security, safety kind of models and stuff, I want to make a distinction between that, people who are actually pulled together to protect property and other kinds of things that are very much around the fundamentals around policing. A distinction between that and organized self-defense forces in the Black community, because the latter is necessary. The latter has always been a part of our movements, whether or not it's talked about. There's a lot of text that's now being released around the role of armed struggle within the broader civil rights movement. There's two books, one I'll mention. One is that nonviolent stuff will get you killed. I forget the author of that. And then there's also We Will Shoot Back, Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement by Dr. Akinwole-Bandele. And just talks about just a lot of the experiences of communities who organize themselves to say that, yes, tactically we recognize the importance of utilizing passive self-defense, passive nonviolence resistance as a tool, but also know that we will not die for a tactic, that we will continue to defend ourselves however we need to do that. So I want to make that distinction, because I am, and we all firmly believe that we need to be able to continue to do whatever we have to do to defend our lives and our communities.
Great, thank you all. I'll take the opportunity for the last few minutes to raise up some questions from the chat. In a sort of going back to this idea of performative support for dismantling white supremacy in its various forms, Jonathan asks, one question for us is, do we or how do we demand criminal prosecution for acts of right-wing terrorism, or do we assume it's illusory to do so?
It's interesting. We're having some of these conversations internally as a self-identified abolitionist organization. Do we subscribe to an institution that we seek to abolish for justice, right? And recognizing that our communities, by and large, are not there, that most people are still very much in a place of, if not this, then what? Question around abolition, and what is the alternative? And so I think when we really grapple with that question, we have to figure out what actually works. Not only what actually works, but also how do we prevent these kinds of white supremacist violence from happening in the beginning. So we do know a few things. One, that if they are in fact arrested or even sentenced for that matter, the likelihood of them dismantling or shedding themselves of that kind of ideology in prison is highly unlikely, right? We know that if anything, they'll probably be deified when they get into the prison because of the acts that they committed out on the street. But we do know, however, in the absence of that, what then are we left with in terms of some kind of response, some kind of action that will show that this will not be tolerated? So it's not an easy answer. And I do, again, stand firmly in the position that our communities are left with a very particular kind of position, which is that we have to defend ourselves to make sure that in the interim, we aren't sitting there getting killed, waiting for that question to be answered.
In a similar vein, Wendy Ake asks, is there a consistency and strategy around reclaiming the state apparatus or a strategic role for reconstituting the state?
I mean, as an anarchist, no. And I think that, in this kind of moment of colorblind racism, racism thrives most effectively when the people who are helming a given system are not white. There are so many things that that President Obama did in expanding the apparatus for deportation, and so many other things that, as we're coming at Trump for doing the things that he's doing, the President Obama's facilitation of the expansion of these systems is kind of going ignored. I think that trying to kind of reclaim the state becomes a bit of a trap, because in order to lead a nation state, in order to have power within the American state, overwhelmingly, like, you have to support the interests of capital. And there are some people who don't. There aren't a lot of them. And some of those people who aren't are making some really complicated compromises in order to get some of their politics through, and also in order to remain whatever electable means. I think that one of the most exciting things for me as someone who identifies as a Black anarchist is the kind of potential for mutual aid that's coming out of this moment. Unfortunately, so much of mutual aid at this moment is coming from the fact that the state has completely abandoned people, in giving families like relief checks, in ensuring that there are moratoriums on eviction and rent and whatever else. And what I've seen in so many parts of the country are these, like, you know, people are putting up these like refrigerators across cities that have food that people can take. People are even, you know, as people are trying to socially distance, are doing childcare and all kinds of projects to keep one another safe and well and alive as best as they can. And I think that, you know, in this moment of this intensified centralization of power, I almost feel like thinking about how to become a part of the state apparatus like doesn't seem like the best idea, because this, if any moment, seems like the time when you are most corruptible and kind of most co-optable in your kind of progressive or whatever attempts to help. I think that the most important priority is to kind of tap into different community projects and see how we can, as best as possible, like, direct resources directly to community institutions and to families and to whatever we can, as opposed to thinking about taking the state, because this is a conversation that like neo-Marxists have been thinking about since Marx died, you know, and there's not really been a good answer yet. But this is kind of my position.
Great, thank you. That's really a very thorough and compelling response, Zoe. I'm going to close us out from this awesome webinar with a question from Tarso, PRA's own Tarso. Is this framework suggestive of potential desirable new forms of anti-racist alignment or multiracial power building? Is there a potential seed here for an affirmative unity framework that is responsive to the times we're living in or through?
Yes.
Yes.
That's the answer. And yes, that absolutely is. And I, you know, one of the things I always encourage is, you know, there's space for everybody to dig in and to become involved and to increase your involvement to some degree. You know, I teach a community organizing course at City University of New York, and I'm always repeating myself saying that if you're one of those people that sits back and say, you know, if I was alive back then, I would have. If I was around, then I would have. Look outside your window, y'all, like this is it, you know? And so the question I've always posed to people is, well, what are you gonna tell your grandchildren you did in 2020 when all hell was being released on our people? What will you tell your children, your grandchildren that you did? Where were you? And so, you know, it's a necessity that we contribute, and there's so many different ways and spaces. You know, organizations that make up the movement for Black Lives are Black-led, Black-centered, and we welcome Black organizers, Black people who want to become organizers to get involved. For people who are outside of the Black experience, the rising majority exists. For people who are white folks who want to really challenge challenge imperialism in its rawest form and challenge white supremacy. There are many organizations who do that. So there's a place for everybody. And the coordination of those forces is beginning to happen. We're going to see some alignment in some very real ways that I'm, you know, and this is not just optimism speaking, that will shift the trajectory not only of this nation, but of the world.
Ooh.
All right, I think that's a fabulous conclusion to a really wonderful conversation. Thank you, Zoe, Aislinn, Lumumba, Stephen. This was really exceeded expectations, and a wonderful future for PRA's summer webinar series, which continues in 2 weeks. So we hope that you all out there in the nebulous Zoom world will join us. And I want to thank you again so much for coming and for participating.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.